During the funeral of a black police officer, Eaton Carter, his loyal Akita Inu partner, Max, wouldn't stop barking at the casket. What happened next left everyone speechless. Want to know the truth behind Max's behavior and the shocking twist that followed? Stay tuned to the end of the video. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel to see more incredible stories. The soft pitter-patter of rain set the tone for a somber day as the mourners gathered at the cemetery. The air was thick with grief, and the muted gray sky reflected the heavy hearts of everyone present. Among the crowd stood the family of Officer Eaton Carter, a dedicated police officer whose life had been tragically cut short during a warehouse robbery. His mother, a woman of quiet strength, clutched a tissue in her trembling hand, while Eaton's siblings stood beside her, their faces etched with sorrow. They had flown in from California to New York to pay their final respects to the brother and son they had not seen in 5 years. Eaton's colleagues arrived soon after, their polished uniforms and solemn expressions underscoring the weight of the occasion. Among them was a striking figure, a dog of noble stature, his fur glistening in the rain. Max, a loyal Akita Inu and Eaton's trusted partner, walked beside the officers. Max had been by Eaton's side for over a year, and their bond had been one of mutual respect and deep connection. But now the dog seemed subdued, his movements lacking their usual vigor. As the group gathered around the casket, Max lay quietly near the feet of Eaton's colleagues. The silence was broken only by the faint sobs of the grieving family. The officiant began to speak, recounting Eaton's dedication to his job and the community he had served so diligently. But just as the mourners began to immerse themselves in the solemn words, Max rose from his spot and moved toward the casket. At first, it seemed like a simple gesture of respect, a loyal companion saying his final goodbye. The dog sniffed the edge of the casket, his nose tracing the polished wood with an air of curiosity. Then, without warning, Max let out a sharp bark that echoed through the cemetery. The sound startled the mourners, causing a ripple of murmurs and anxious glances. Eaton's new partner, Officer Daniels, tried to calm Max, tugging gently at his leash, but the dog resisted, barking louder and more insistently. "Maybe he's just upset," someone whispered, trying to dismiss the unsettling behavior. But Max's agitation grew. He began pulling on the leash, his paws scrabbling against the ground as if trying to reach the casket. His bark turned to an almost mournful howl, sending chills through the gathered crowd. "Stop him!" Eaton's mother pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "He's making it worse!" Officer Daniels struggled to control the dog, who was now straining against his handler's grip. Max's behavior was so out of character that even Eaton's colleagues, who knew the dog well, began to exchange concerned glances. Finally, one of the senior officers stepped forward. His weathered face bore the calm authority of someone who had seen it all, yet even he seemed shaken by the scene unfolding before him. "I've seen this before," he said softly, addressing the family and the mourners. "Sometimes, dogs like Max, they sense things. If we open the casket, he might settle down." Eaton's mother gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "No, we haven't seen him. We didn't want to." Her voice broke, and she turned to her other children, seeking reassurance. "We should at least try," one of Eaton's siblings murmured. "If it'll calm the dog." The family hesitated, torn between their desire to honor Eaton's memory and the strange, almost primal urgency of the dog's behavior. Finally, his mother gave a reluctant nod. "Do it," she whispered. The funeral director approached the casket, his steps slow and deliberate. The rain fell harder, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. The lid was lifted carefully, and for a moment there was only silence. Then a collective gasp erupted from the crowd, followed by the heart-wrenching cry of Eaton's mother. "That's not him!" she screamed, stumbling backward. Her hands flew to her face, and she shook her head in disbelief. "That's not my son!" The mourners stood frozen, their eyes fixed on the body lying in the casket. The man inside was a stranger, young, dark-haired, but undeniably not Eaton Carter. The atmosphere shifted from one of grief to one of shock and confusion. People began whispering among themselves, their voices a mixture of disbelief and outrage. Max, now silent, lay down beside the casket, his head resting on his paws as if his work was done. His calm demeanor only added to the eerie weight of the revelation. "How could this happen?" Eaton's mother demanded, her voice trembling with anger. "Where is my son?" The senior officer stepped forward again, his face pale. "We'll get to the bottom of this," he said firmly. "I promise you." The ceremony was halted abruptly. The mourners dispersed, their faces a blend of grief and bewilderment. Eaton's family, accompanied by Max and several of Eaton's colleagues, made their way to the police station, seeking answers to the unthinkable mistake. How could a man be declared dead, only for his body to vanish? And who was the stranger in the casket? As they climbed into the waiting cars, Max hopped into the back seat with Eaton's siblings. He rested his head on one of their laps, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and resolve. Whatever had happened to Eaton, Max had ensured that the truth would not remain buried. The cars pulled away from the cemetery, leaving the rain-soaked grounds behind. Unbeknownst to the family, their journey for answers was only just beginning. The police station buzzed with restrained urgency as Eaton Carter's family and colleagues arrived, their faces still etched with shock. The rain that had accompanied the funeral clung to their clothes, a cold reminder of the surreal events they had just witnessed. Max walked silently beside Eaton's younger brother, his head held low but his tail alert, as if sensing that his duty was far from over. Captain Reynolds, the head of Eaton's precinct, met them at the door. His face, usually composed and authoritative, showed visible discomfort. "I can't even begin to express how sorry I am," he said, his voice low. "This is a grave error, no pun intended, and we're going to get to the bottom of it." Eaton's mother, still trembling with anger and grief, stepped forward. "A grave error?" she repeated, her voice sharp. "That's my son we're talking about. How could something like this even happen? And why was a stranger in his casket?" Reynolds gestured toward a conference room. "Please, let's sit down and talk. I've already called the hospital administrator. They're sending someone over to explain." Reluctantly, the family and a handful of Eaton's closest colleagues followed Reynolds into the room. Max lay at Eaton's mother's feet, his steady presence a small comfort amid the chaos. Outside the glass walls of the room, officers moved purposefully, some stealing glances at the grieving family. The precinct had rarely seen such a mix of outrage and confusion. The door opened, and a man in a white coat stepped inside. His name tag read Dr. Charles Bennett, and his expression mirrored the guilt and tension in the room. He held a folder tightly against his chest as if it were a shield. "Mrs. Carter," he began, "on behalf of my staff, I want to extend our deepest apologies. This is an unprecedented mistake, and we are committed to finding out how it happened." Mrs. Carter's eyes narrowed. "Committed to finding out? You don't already know?" Dr. Bennett's face flushed. "The events of that night were chaotic," he admitted. "Let me start from the beginning. 2 men were brought into our emergency room after the incident at the warehouse. One was pronounced dead on arrival, and the other was in critical condition and required immediate surgery. In the confusion, it appears that their identities were mismatched." The room fell silent as the weight of his words settled over the group. Eaton's older sister, who had remained quiet until now, leaned forward. "You're telling us that you didn't check their IDs? That you just guessed who was who?" Dr. Bennett opened the folder, his hands shaking slightly. "It wasn't intentional," he said quickly. "The officers who brought them in identified the deceased as Officer Eaton Carter. That information was passed along, and we didn't question it. The living patient had severe facial injuries and was placed in a medically induced coma. Unfortunately, his ID was not verified in the chaos." Reynolds interjected, his voice cold. "And what about their belongings? Every officer has a badge and an ID card." Dr. Bennett nodded, flipping through the papers. "That's where the oversight occurred. The personal effects of both men were logged and stored, but no one thought to cross-reference them with the patient's identities. We only realized the mistake when I reviewed the evidence earlier today." He placed 2 sealed evidence bags on the table. One was marked deceased, the other critical condition. The room held its breath as Dr. Bennett opened the first bag. He pulled out a wallet and handed it to Reynolds, who opened it slowly. Inside was Eaton's badge, his name and photo unmistakable. "This belonged to the man in critical condition," Dr. Bennett confirmed. "It's Eaton Carter." A gasp rippled through the room. Mrs. Carter's hands flew to her mouth as tears streamed down her face. "You mean my son is alive?" she whispered. Dr. Bennett nodded. "Yes, ma'am. He's currently in a medically induced coma at our hospital." The relief in the room was palpable, but it was quickly tempered by anger. "And the man in the casket?" one of Eaton's colleagues demanded. "Who was he?" Dr. Bennett opened the second bag and extracted another badge. "The deceased was Officer Michael Collins," he said solemnly. "I've contacted his family. They'll be arriving tomorrow." The mention of Michael's name sent a fresh wave of emotion through the room. Collins had been new to the precinct, a promising young officer whose life had been cut tragically short. His death was a blow to everyone who knew him. Reynolds rubbed his temples, his frustration evident. "This is a disaster. 2 families grieving the wrong sons because of your negligence." Dr. Bennett looked down, shame etched into his features. "We will do everything in our power to make this right." Mrs. Carter, still shaken, clutched Max's leash for support. "I want to see my son," she said firmly, "now." The group drove in silence to the hospital, the weight of the revelation settling over them. Max sat in the back seat, his head resting on Mrs. Carter's lap. The hospital staff was waiting for them when they arrived, leading the group to the ICU. Behind a glass partition lay Eaton, his face obscured by bandages and monitors beeping steadily around him. Mrs. Carter pressed her hand against the glass. "That's my baby," she said softly, tears flowing freely. Max stood beside her, his tail wagging gently, as if he knew Eaton was still there. Dr. Bennett cleared his throat. "We're optimistic about his recovery," he said. "His injuries were severe, but he's responded well to treatment. It's only a matter of time before he regains consciousness." Mrs. Carter turned to him, her voice firm. "You'd better hope he does, because if anything happens to him—" Her threat hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Back at the station, Reynolds gathered the officers for an emergency briefing. "This is a wake-up call for all of us," he said. Mistakes like this can't happen. We owe it to our community, to our officers, and to their families to do better." As the meeting ended, the precinct settled into an uneasy quiet. The weight of what had happened loomed over everyone. Max, back at the Carter home, curled up on Eaton's bed, his head resting on a shirt that still carried his scent. The family knew the road ahead would be long and uncertain, but for the first time since the tragedy, hope had returned. Eaton was alive, and Max, the loyal partner who refused to give up, had been right all along. The sterile white walls of the hospital ICU seemed to hum with an oppressive silence. Eaton Carter lay motionless, his bandaged face illuminated by the dim glow of the medical monitors. The steady beep of the heart monitor was the only sound breaking the stillness, a quiet assurance that life still pulsed within him. Outside the glass partition, his family sat vigil, each moment dragging on like an eternity. Max lay on the floor at Mrs. Carter's feet, his large frame rising and falling with steady breaths. Despite the hours of waiting, the Akita Inu never stirred, his eyes fixed on the room where his partner lay. The hospital staff had allowed him to stay, moved by his unwavering loyalty. 2 weeks passed with little change. The doctors remained cautiously optimistic, but the waiting wore on the family. Eaton's siblings alternated shifts at the hospital, and Mrs. Carter refused to leave, sleeping in a chair in the waiting room. Max was her constant companion, a silent source of comfort during sleepless nights. Then, one quiet morning, everything changed. The beeping of the monitors suddenly quickened, and a nurse rushed into the room. The family, startled awake, pressed against the glass as the medical team surrounded Eaton's bed. After a few tense moments, one of the doctors stepped into the hallway, a small smile breaking through the tension. "He's waken up," the doctor said softly. Mrs. Carter gasped, tears streaming down her face as she gripped the doctor's arm. "Can we see him?" The doctor nodded. "Give us a moment to make sure he's stable, and then you can go in." A short while later, the family was ushered into the room. Eaton's eyes were half open, his gaze unfocused but unmistakably alive. He tried to speak, but the effort brought only a faint croak. Mrs. Carter leaned over him, her tears falling onto his hand as she held it tightly. "You're safe now, baby," she whispered. "You're safe." Max, standing beside her, wagged his tail softly, his ears perking up at the sound of Eaton's voice. When Eaton's gaze finally settled on the dog, his lips curled into a weak smile. He raised a trembling hand, and Max stepped closer, pressing his nose into his partner's palm. The reunion was brief, as Eaton's strength quickly waned. The doctors assured the family that his condition would improve with time, but for now he needed rest. As the days turned into weeks, Eaton's recovery progressed steadily. Each milestone, sitting up, speaking, taking his first steps, was celebrated with quiet joy. Through it all, Max remained by his side, a constant reminder of the bond that had endured even the most trying of circumstances. The time eventually came for Eaton to leave the hospital. His return home was bittersweet. While his body was healing, the emotional scars of the warehouse incident lingered. The memory of his fallen colleague, Michael Collins, weighed heavily on him. The precinct held a formal memorial for Michael, and Eaton spoke at the service, his voice breaking as he recounted the bravery of the young officer who had given his life in the line of duty. In the weeks that followed, Eaton threw himself into his recovery. He attended physical therapy sessions and spent countless hours training with Max, determined to rebuild their partnership. His colleagues rallied around him, offering their support and encouragement. The precinct also implemented new protocols to ensure that the mistakes made during the night of the warehouse incident would never be repeated. A year later, Eaton stood in the precinct's training yard, Max at his side. The pair had just completed a rigorous series of tests designed to assess Eaton's readiness to return to duty. Captain Reynolds approached, a rare smile on his face as he handed Eaton his badge. "Welcome back, Officer Carter," he said, clapping Eaton on the shoulder. "We've missed you." Eaton glanced down at Max, who sat patiently at his feet, his tail wagging. "We're ready," Eaton replied, his voice steady and confident. Their first day back on duty was uneventful, a welcome contrast to the chaos that had upended their lives a year earlier. As they patrolled the quiet streets of their community, Eaton felt a renewed sense of purpose. The bond he shared with Max was stronger than ever, forged in the crucible of hardship and loss. Eaton and Max became a symbol of resilience within the department, their story inspiring others to persevere in the face of adversity. The precinct held a ceremony to honor their return, during which Mrs. Carter and the family of Michael Collins were recognized for their strength and support. Despite the challenges he had faced, Eaton never lost sight of what mattered most: the people and the principles he had sworn to protect. His journey, though marked by tragedy, had reaffirmed his commitment to his community and to the ideals of justice and integrity. As Eaton and Max returned to their patrol car that evening, the sun setting in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Eaton reached down to scratch Max behind the ears. The dog leaned into his touch, a contented sigh escaping him. "We're back where we belong, buddy," Eaton said softly. Max responded with a wag of his tail, his loyalty unwavering. Their story was far from over, but for now Eaton and Max were ready to face whatever lay ahead, together. Thank you for watching. Eaton and Max's story reminds us of the unbreakable bond between humans and animals and the importance of never giving up on the truth. What do you think about their incredible journey? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss more stories like this one.